Hello, and thank you for joining me in Annie Stories. In today's video, I'll be reading William Hoff's fairy tale called The Cavern of Steenfoll. Join me in this reading for a Scottish legend. So without further ado, let us begin. The Cavern of Steenfoll. Many years ago, two fishermen lived happily together upon one of the rocky islands off the Scottish coast. They were both unmarried and had no near relations, and their united efforts, although they were of very different dispositions, sufficed to provide them with all they needed. They were much of an age, but in appearance and character, they resembled each other about as much as an eagle resembles a calf. Caspar Stump was a short fat man with a broad fat face like a full moon, and good-tempered twinkling eyes, which seemed as though they were strangers to trouble and care. Not only was he very fat, he was also rather lazy, and so the household duties fell to his share. He had to cook and bake, make the nets to catch fish and sell in the market, and help to cultivate their little field. His companion was the direct opposite, tall and thin with bold features, a hooked nose like a hawk's, and sharp eyes. He was the hardest working and most intrepid of fishermen, the most venturesome climber after birds' eggs, which were found in the rocky crevices of the cliffs, and the most industrious field laborer on the island, as well as being one of the keenest to drive a bargain in the market of Kirkwall. But as his wares were good, and he always traded honestly, everyone liked to deal with him, and Will Hawk, as his neighbors nicknamed him, in spite of his fondness for money, always shared his profits willingly with Caspar Stump, so that the two of them not only made a very good living, but were able to put by something for a rainy day. But Will Hawk was not content with that. He wanted to be rich, very rich, and as he knew that sheer hard work, such as his, rarely brought in extraordinary wealth, he began to think that he must try and find out some other means of making money, and taking it for granted that he would succeed, he discussed the matter freely with Caspar Stump. Caspar, who accepted everything that Will said as gospel truth, told his neighbors of the fortune his companion was about to make, and so a rumor went abroad that Will Hawk had sold his soul to the evil one. At first Will laughed at these reports, but gradually he began to wish that some spirit would appear and tell him where he might discover buried treasure, and he ceased to contradict the neighbors when they joked him about it. It is true, he still continued to carry on his ordinary occupation, but with less zeal, and often wasted the time when he should have been fishing in idle wanderings after adventures, which he hoped would make him rich. Unfortunately for him, as he was one day standing on the seashore, gazing out to the sea, as though he expected the waves rolling in to bring a fortune to his feet, one big wave washed up a quantity of shingle and loose seaweed, and amongst the seaweed a yellow ball, a ball of pure gold. Will stood as though enchanted. His hopes of untold wealth had not been empty dreams. The sea had given him gold, pure shining gold, which the action of the sea had worn down, probably from a large bar to a ball the size of a bullet. It seemed quite clear to him now that at some time a richly laden vessel must have gone to pieces on the rocks, and that it was for him to find and raise the buried treasures hidden beneath the waves. From this time, he devoted all his energies to the task, carefully hiding his find from all, even from his friend. He neglected everything else, and spent days and nights on the seashore, not casting fishing nets, but using a drag which he had made on purpose to haul in treasure. His only reward was poverty, for he had ceased to make money himself, and Caspar's sleepy efforts did not bring in enough to feed the two of them. In searching for riches, all the little fortune they possessed was lost. But just as easygoing Casper had once allowed Will Hawk to provide the money for his maintenance, so he now accepted poverty without complaint. And it was this silent endurance on the part of his friend that spurred Will on to further efforts to amass wealth. But what made him still more intent on continuing the search was that, whenever he lay down to sleep, it seemed to him that someone whispered a word in his ear. It was always the same, but he never could remember it when he was awake. It is true that there seemed no connection between this circumstance and his present quest, but on a mind like Will's, everything seemed to make an impression, and even this mysterious whispering strengthened him in the belief that he was destined for a great piece of good fortune, and that he would one day find a large heap of gold. One day, he was surprised by a storm whilst on the shore where he had found the ball of gold, and the violence of it caused him to take shelter in a neighboring cave. This cave, which the people call the Cavern of Steenfoll, consisted of a long subterranean passage with 2 openings to the sea, which afforded the waves free passage to and fro. And there they roared and foamed as they rushed along it. The cave was only accessible in one spot from the land, and that through a crevice in the roof. But it was seldom that any but reckless boys ventured there, for in addition to the dangers of the place, it was supposed to be haunted. With great difficulty, Will succeeded in letting himself down, and took his seat upon a jutting rock about 12 feet from the surface. Here, with the waves roaring beneath his feet, and the storm raging above his head, he fell into his usual way of thinking about the sunken ship, and what sort of vessel it could have been. For in spite of having questioned all the oldest inhabitants on the island, he had been unable to obtain any news of a wreck in that place. How long he had sat there he did not know himself, but when he at length awoke from his dreams, he found that the storm had passed over, and he was just about to climb out of the cave, when he heard a voice from the depths which pronounced the word Carmelhan quite distinctly. "Why," cried he, "that is the word I have heard so often in my dreams. What can it mean?" Terrified, he began to climb quickly upwards, when, just as he was creeping out of the crevice, he heard once more, "Carmelhan," softly whispered from the depths. Then he fled like a frightened deer to his home. Will was, however, no coward. He had merely been taken unawares. Besides that, his craze for gold was too strong in him for the appearance of danger to frighten him from the path he had entered upon. One moonlight night, as he was using his drag in his search for treasures near the Cavern of Steenfoll, it caught fast in something. He pulled it with all his strength, but could not move it. In the meantime, the wind had risen. Dark clouds drifted across the sky. The boat rocked violently and threatened to overturn, but Will would not give in. He tugged and pulled until at length the resistance ceased. And as he felt no weight, he thought the cords of the net must have broken. But just as the clouds were about to cover the moon, a round black mass rose to the surface, and once more he heard the word Carmelhan whispered. He would have seized it, but as he was about to stretch out his arm, it disappeared in the darkness of the night, and the storm broke, forcing him to seek shelter beneath the rocks. Here he fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, but only to endure the same restless misery that he endured by day, owing to his everlasting longing for wealth. The first rays of the sun illumined the surface of the water when Will awoke. He was about to set out upon his accustomed work when he saw something approaching him from a distance. He recognized it to be a boat with a man in it, but what aroused his curiosity was that the boat was moving along without the assistance of either sails or rudder, and the bows were turned to the shore. The boat came nearer and nearer and stopped at length beside Will's boat, and Will could see that the person in it was a little wizened old man, dressed in yellow linen with a red pointed nightcap on his head. His eyes were closed, and he looked as though he were dead. Will called to him several times without obtaining an answer, and was about to fasten a cord to the boat in order to tow it along when the man opened his eyes and writhed about in a fashion that filled even the hardy fisherman with horror. "Where am I?" he asked with a deep sigh, speaking in Dutch, and Will, who had learned a few words of that language from the Dutch erring fishers, told him the name of the island and asked him who he was and what had brought him there. "I came to look for the Carmelhan," he said. "What is the Carmelhan?" cried the fisherman eagerly. "The Carmelhan does not exist any longer," the man said. "But it was once a fine ship, heavily laden with gold." "When was it wrecked, and where?" "It happened more than 100 years ago. I am not quite certain where. I have come to find the place and to fish up the lost gold. If you will help me, we will divide whatever we find." "I agree with all my heart, but what must I do?" asked Will. "What you have to do requires courage. You must go to the wildest and most deserted portion of the island at midnight, take a cow with you, kill it, and get someone to wind you up in its skin. Your companion must then lay you down on the ground and leave you, and before the clock strikes 1 o'clock, you will know where the treasures of the Carmelhan lie." "But that was how old Engrel was lost, soul and body," cried Will in terror. "You are without doubt the evil one, and I will have nothing to do with you," and he rode hastily away. The little man ground his teeth with rage and abused him roundly, but the fisherman bent to his oars and was soon out of hearing, and after he had turned and rounded a rock, he was out of sight also. But the knowledge that the evil spirit had endeavored to make use of his avarice in order to lure him into his toils with gold did not cure the infatuated fisherman. On the contrary, he intended to make use of the information he had obtained from the little man without getting into his clutches, and so he continued to fish all around the barren coast for gold, neglecting the wealth of fish he might have obtained in other parts of the sea, in the same way that he neglected all his other work, so that day by day he and his companion sank into deeper poverty, until at length they wanted for the necessities of life. But although this state of things was entirely owing to Will Hawk's obstinacy and greed, and that the support of both of them fell to Caspar Stump alone, the latter never made him the slightest reproach, but showed him the same deference, the same confidence in his better judgment as in the days when all his undertakings were successful. This increased Will's troubles considerably, but drove him still more to seek for money, because he hoped to repay his friend for his present deprivations. The whispered word Carmelhan resounded ever in his slumbers. In short, want, disappointed expectations, and avarice at length drove him mad, so that he decided to do what the little man had advised. Although he knew from hearsay that he was selling himself to the powers of darkness, all Caspar's representations were in vain. Will became more violent the more he was besought to give up his intentions. The good-natured, weak-minded fellow at last gave in and consented to assist him in carrying out his plans. Both their hearts were filled with grief as they led out a beautiful cow, the last of their possessions. They had brought her up from a calf and had forborne to sell her because they could not bear to trust her in strange hands. But the evil spirit that had taken possession of Will's mind stifled all better feeling in him, and Caspar could resist him in nothing. It was September, and the long nights of the Scottish winter had begun, and the dark clouds were racing along before the rough wind and seemed to lose themselves in the waters of the Clyde. Deep shadows filled the mountain clefts, and the damp turfy marshes and the sullen streams looked dark and forbidding. Will Hawk went in advance, and Caspar followed, shuddering at his own audacity. Tears filled his dim eyes as often as he looked at the poor cow, which went so trustfully to meet its death at the hand that had hitherto tended it. They reached at length the boggy pass, overgrown with moss and heather, and strewn with large stones, and surrounded by a wild chain of mountains that lost themselves in mist, and were seldom crossed by the foot of man. Over the boggy ground they went, until they reached a great stone in the center, from which a frightened eagle soared screaming. The poor cow lowed mournfully, as though she recognized the horror of the place and the fate that awaited her. Caspar turned away to hide his fast-flowing tears. He looked down the rocky way they had come, from whence one could hear the moaning of the sea, and then looked up towards the mountain tops, hidden by a black cloud, from which a dull murmuring came. When he again looked at Will, he had already bound the poor cow to the stone, and stood with axe raised ready to strike. This was too much for poor Caspar. Wringing his hands, he fell upon his knees, and entreated Will to desist from tempting Providence, and to spare the life of the poor animal. "Be it as you will," replied the infatuated man, "but if you have your way, you may as well kill me instead of the cow, for otherwise I shall surely die of hunger." It was in vain for Caspar to reason with him, and to protest that in future he would work hard in order to provide a living for both of them. Will would not listen. He threw away the axe, but seizing a knife, declared that as Caspar preferred the cow to him, he would put an end to his wretched life. Poor Caspar seized his hand, and snatching the knife, threw it away. Then taking the axe, he struck the cow such a tremendous blow that it fell dead at its master's feet. Caspar, assisted by Will, then hurriedly removed the hide, and Will allowed his friend to envelope him in it, although he seemed suddenly to have been stricken with terror at what he was doing. The thunderstorm had increased in violence, and by the time Will was firmly fastened into the cow's hide, it was so dark that the two friends could no longer see each other, and bade each other farewell in total darkness. Left to himself, Will endured an agony of fear and suspense. At length, he would gladly have disentangled himself from the hide and rushed after Caspar, but he had been too firmly tied up to be able to free himself. The storm continued to increase in fury, until at length the waters rose and almost covered him, and he began to think that he would be drowned, when a sort of a waterspout arose, and, catching him up, dashed him to the foot of the rocks with so much force that he became unconscious. When he regained his senses, he felt bruised and weak. He could hear a faint sound of singing, which at first he took to be merely the sighing and moaning of the waves. But as it grew louder, he began to recognize the tune as a hymn, which he had heard the fishermen singing on board a Dutch herring smack. Nearer and nearer came the sound of the music, and presently, to his surprise, he saw a procession of human figures approaching him. Grief and fear were depicted on their countenances, and their clothes were all dripping with water. As they came close up to him, the singing ceased. The procession was led by several musicians. Then came a number of sailors, and behind them walked a big fat man, dressed in quaint old-fashioned garments, which were richly embroidered with gold threads. He had a sword by his side, and in his hand he carried a long thick Spanish cane with a gold knob. A boy walked beside him, carrying the long pipe from which his master drew a whiff from time to time. A number of other richly dressed men accompanied him, all of them carrying pipes, though not such handsome ones as that of the stout man. Behind these came a number of women, all handsomely attired in old-fashioned garments. Some of them carried little children in their arms, and some led children by the hand. A crowd of Dutch sailors closed the procession, each of them having a quid of tobacco in his mouth and a pipe between his teeth, which he smoked in gloomy silence. As the whole assembly began to close round Will, the smoke from their pipes grew denser and denser, and he felt as though he were about to be smothered. He was by nature a courageous man, but a nameless terror now seemed to seize him, which was increased by the sight of the little yellow man, who had suddenly appeared and was seated close beside him. He looked exactly as he had done before, except that now, as though to mock the assembled company, he too had a pipe in his mouth. In an agony of terror, Will turned to the big stout man and cried, "In the name of him you serve, who are you, and what do you want with me?" The big man took 3 whiffs from his pipe in solemn silence. Then he handed his pipe to his servant and replied coldly, "I am Alfred Franz van der Swelder, captain of the ship Carmelhan from Amsterdam, which was lost with all hands on this rocky coast on the return journey from Batavia. These are my officers and passengers, and those are my brave sailors, all of whom were drowned with me. Why do you call us from out the depths of the sea? Why do you disturb our rest? I wish to know where the treasures of the Carmelhan lie hidden. At the bottom of the sea. Where? In the cavern of Steenfoll. How can I reach them? A goose will dive after an herring. Are not the treasures of the Carmelhan worth much more? How much shall I succeed in obtaining? More than you will ever be able to spend." The little yellow man grinned, and the whole assembly burst out laughing. "Have you finished your questioning?" asked the captain. "I have. Farewell," replied Will. "Farewell until we meet again," answered the Dutchman, and turned to go. The musicians again led the procession, and they turned to depart in the same order in which they had come, singing the same solemn chant, which faded away in the distance, until at length it became lost in the sound of the waves beating upon the shore. Will now exerted all his strength to free himself from the hide that wrapped him round so tightly. He succeeded at last in freeing one arm, and then commenced to loosen the cords that fastened him into the hide until he untied all the knots and rolled out of the hide. Without losing a moment, he hastened home, where he found poor Caspar lying unconscious upon the floor of the hut. Having restored him to his senses with some trouble, the good fellow wept tears of joy to see once again the friend of his youth whom he believed to have lost forever. But his joy was soon quenched when Will told him of the desperate undertaking he had now on hand. "I could no longer endure the misery of this wretched place," he said, "now that it is within my power to attain the riches for us both. Follow me or not, as you will." With these words, Will took up a torch, a flint and steel, and a rope, and hastened away. Caspar followed as quickly as he could, and found his friend standing by the crevice in the rock leading to the cavern of Steenfoll. He was making ready to lower himself by the rope into the black depths below. Finding that all his entreaties to desist availed nothing, Caspar prepared to descend with his friend, but Will bade him remain where he was and hold the rope. With fearful exertions, which only the blindest avarice could have driven him to make, he succeeded in climbing down into the cavern until he reached a portion of projecting rock, beneath which the black waves dashed to and fro, crested with white foam. He gazed eagerly into the water and saw something gleaming in the depths. Laying aside his torch, he dived beneath the waves and seized a heavy object, which he brought up to the surface. It was an iron chest full of gold pieces. He told his companion what he had found, but paid no attention to his entreaties to be content with what he had, and to reascend. Will thought he had obtained the first fruits of his labors, and dived again. A mocking laugh arose from the depths of the sea, and the diver rose no more. Such was the end of Will Hawk. Casper went home a changed man. The terrible experience he had undergone were too much for his weak head and sensitive heart, and unsettled his mind. He allowed everything belonging to him to go to rack and ruin, and wandered about day and night, staring before him with unseeing eyes, and pitied but avoided by all. A fisherman is said to have seen and recognized Will Hawk one stormy night amongst the crew of the Carmelhan, close to the shore, and on the same night Casper Stump disappeared and was never seen again, although he was sought for in every direction. Folks aver, however, that from that time forward the crew of the Carmelhan appear at certain times in the Cavern of Steenfoll, and that both Will Hawk and Casper Stump are seen with them. The end. Thank you for listening. Do consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. I have over 100 stories in my channel for you to enjoy. Thanks for giving my small channel a chance to entertain you.